We're taking this pile of semi-used parts and adding a ton of new parts so that we can build a 5 kilowatt monster of an e-bike. This was quite the undertaking. It's going to span a 5-part series where I'll go over every step and every mistake that I made along the way. So buckle up because I have an insane amount of work to do, so let's go. Found the frame and the motor kit on Craigslist, which is pretty rare because you don't really see these enduro bike frame styles nor like big motors on Craigslist, or at least I don't in my area. I wasn't even really looking for this specifically, but since I came across it, I was like, okay, well, I'll just build a bike then. This was only the 3rd e-bike I've ever built, so I still had a lot to learn. The used parts I did purchase were pretty complete, but I did need to purchase some new parts to make a fully assembled bike. I definitely wanted to add a digital display, but more on that later. Almost finished with the new part unboxing, and I couldn't help but start assembling things already, even though I have a ton of other prep work to do, but I just couldn't resist, so here I am installing the chainring on the crank. One part done. That was pretty easy, only about 1,000 more steps to go. The used parts came somewhat assembled already, and I needed to completely disassemble everything because I'm going to be painting all of the pieces. My cat is definitely interested in this build, but he didn't want to be the center of attention, so that's okay. I did get these parts at a discount, but it wasn't like a crazy deal. I think I bought everything for $11.50, and it's always somewhat risky whenever you buy somebody else's project that they either started or semi-started. You always just seem to find things that are kind of weird or missing, and that can lead to more frustration than if you just paid more and you bought something new. I thought for sure that these panels were going to be scratched up or dented, but that protective film really protected them a lot, and they're like pristine. They're perfect. Now comes my least favorite part, which is sanding and paint prep. I'd like to take this moment to remind you that this is not a painting channel, even though that's what it looks like. This guy's always painting things. Now I'm really loving my hex camo patterns, but I wanted to try something new with this build, so I wanted to do kind of like a Digi-Camo, like digitized camouflage. This is my first time ever attempting this, so I didn't really know how it was going to come out, but I did need a stencil, so here I am making it out of acrylic. I also tried to arrange the digits in a tiger stripe pattern, so it's really a blend of 2 camos in one. I also remembered to set the laser height correctly. This stencil came out perfectly the first time, so I was really happy about that. I'm using acrylic stencils because I paint a lot of layers very quickly, and other materials probably would not hold up to that. These tiny little digits are actually really hard to pick up. Now the paint scheme I'm going for is a subdued urban digital camouflage, which is mostly grays but some light blue. Look at all these colors, this is total madness. Now before I can start laying down stencils and getting on with the paint job, I need to prime everything, so you know what time it is, it's prime time. I did try gold on the rear spring to try and match the front forks, but I later changed this to a more burnt bronze color because I thought it looked better. This bike seems like it's small, like there's not a lot of surface area to the bike, but there are a ton of parts to it. I haven't even started technically painting, I'm just priming it. Still priming. Priming is finally done and we can move on to the actual painting, the fun part. As soon as I sprayed the first stencil, I knew that this was actually gonna turn out pretty cool. There are lots of grays in this paint job, and this is the first layer of gray. After this, following up with another layer of a lighter gray than this. When I started stacking the layers, I quickly realized that my stencil was not grid perfect. And I don't really understand how that was possible because I literally used a grid to make it. But when I started to interlock the digits, they didn't quite line up exactly perfectly. Maybe like 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters off, which seems fine, but I was going for precision here. If I overlaid them in the same orientation, then they would line up, but I wanted more variation than that. So my options for variation but also following the same orientation made it a bit more challenging. I think this is still only the second layer of gray, and after this will be a layer of black. So far that's primer gray, a darker gray, a lighter gray, and now black. And with each layer I'm going with a more contrasting shade, so that's lighter and then darker and then lighter and then darker. I definitely could have stopped before putting this black layer and that would have looked fine just like that, but I usually overdo things, so then I just keep overdoing them until they look less overdone, if that makes sense. To me, there's definitely a sweet spot between not enough and way too much. And usually you have to cross that line a few times before you know exactly where it is. There definitely was a point along this paint job where I thought maybe I definitely crossed that threshold where maybe this is a bit much. If you look at this top piece here, I'm going a little too quickly and things are not lining up as well as they should be. I ended up breaking down one of the larger stencils and that made it a lot easier to paint the little parts like this. That turned out to be kind of like a happy accident because I was really liking how it looked when you could see some of the fade from the spray can. When you have your stencil cover the entire surface area, then every edge is a hard edge. But with these smaller pieces, you actually get to see the fade from the spray can on the edge without a boundary. And even though it's not as clean or precise looking, to me the effect that it produced was just really cool, and I started wanting to incorporate some of that on the larger pieces where I could cover it in the entire stencil. This effect was even more dramatic with the light blue on the more darker grays and black. I really wasn't happy with how the top was coming out on this, so I decided to re-primer that and start fresh on just that section. Everything else I was pretty pleased with at this point, and I started to incorporate that soft edge look to some of the other pieces like this. This was a ton of painting. I think I'm only like 2/3 of the way done here. I'm definitely glad I redid the top because it turned out looking a lot better than how it was before. The swing arm is actually my favorite piece. I don't know why. Something about the blend of the, uniformity to the chaos, it just worked out in a way that to me just looked the best. Once I started hitting the top with the blue and started layering even more on top of that, I just thought it kept looking better and better. At this point though, I took a step back and everything started looking like it was more confetti than it was camouflage. Like the contrast of the colors was just too much. I actually slept on what I should do to fix this problem because I liked the pattern, but there was too much contrast going on. It just really looked like confetti to me. So my solution to subdue the color more was just to give it a light mist of black. It was kind of terrifying to do this because I knew that if I put too much black then it wouldn't look good and I'd have to start over again, which I didn't want to do. And if I didn't put enough then it would still look like confetti and I wouldn't be happy with it. So finding that line was kind of nerve-wracking. I just went really slow and slightly misted it over and then check it and then just a little more, check it again. And it actually turned out to be a lot more forgiving to do that technique than I anticipated. I don't even know how many hours of painting this was, but I think it was like 3 or 4 days, and I had to paint each piece differently because I have to let it dry before I can turn it or lay it on its other side. That swing arm just kept looking cooler and cooler with the more layers that I put on it. finally clear coating everything because I was finished. I think with all the techniques applied, it came out really well. Probably better than I even imagined in my head. I still had a bunch of little parts to paint, but these were totally a breeze compared to what I had just done. This is the chain tensioner and some of the grip ends. Well, I had thought I was done painting camo, and then I found the kickstand and the handlebar stem. But at this point, I was much better and much faster at it. Now that the painting is finally over, we can start assembling things, and just making sure the battery and controller can fit inside of the frame. I will be going over all of the electrical components of this build later on in this video, very shortly. And now those pieces are painted black, so I'm just assembling the grips and throttle. This chain tensioner turned out to be absolutely horrible. I would not recommend it. I would recommend just using a regular bike derailleur because those don't have the chain fly off when you're pedaling. I wanted to bench test all the electrical components just to make sure everything was working correctly. The battery is a 72 volt 30 amp hour custom made pack with LiPo cells. It has a 50 amp BMS, which is the limiting factor of this bike's power. The controller is an 80 amp Subvoton sine wave controller. The motor is a QS motor 50H V3, which does have a peak output of 6 kilowatts. This was my first time testing the components, and I was really hoping that they worked, and they did. This controller did not come with an LCD display, so I purchased one separately, hoping that I would be able to get it to work. I knew the connections were not the same, but I figured I could splice my way into making it work. And although I did manage to get the display to power on from the controller, it wouldn't actually read anything, unfortunately. After a lot of different attempts and also looking into some sort of conversions, I decided to contact the manufacturer, and they told me it would not work because the controllers that have displays are actually different inside. They have different chips, different firmware, so you can't just add one. With enough effort, I'm pretty sure I could have converted it with some intermediary firmware box, but I didn't want to mess with that, at least at this point, because I had other issues to deal with, especially with this headset. The split ring would not fit down on the taper tube at all, and no matter how I arranged it or tightened it, it always just rocked back and forth and it was loose, and I couldn't figure out why that was happening. So I thought it was this split ring, and I was like, okay, well, I need to slam it down on there. But that wasn't it, and do you know what the problem was? Do you see that right there? That's a bearing, and what? There's no bearing on the bottom part of the tube. Again, one of the pitfalls of buying somebody else's project. Sometimes things are missing, like the bottom bearing. Since I was already buying a new bottom bearing, I figured I might as well replace the top one with a new one as well. That was not a good idea because that race was almost impossible to get out. That bearing I pulled out said 42 millimeters on the side of the bearing. So naturally I bought a 42 millimeter bearing, but the inside of the cup is only 40 millimeters. I don't even know how that's possible, but this bearing that came out of it must not have been 42 millimeters. I had to wait 2 weeks for this bearing, and it definitely did not fit. Definitely some conflicting interpretations of what 42 millimeters means. Now the bottom bearing that I got is 52 millimeters and it actually fits inside of the 52 millimeter hole. Which is totally crazy, I know, it's almost like it was designed to fit in that hole, and look, it fits like a glove. I'm not waiting 2 more weeks for a bearing that won't fit, so I'm taking things into my own hands, or my own Dremel. You know, everyone has their interpretation of what 42 means to them, and this is what 42 means to me. Okay, so it's not perfectly round, but it actually fits really well considering. Should I have just left that bearing in there to begin with? Yes, definitely. It was only slightly crunchy. Speaking of things that do not fit, we have this rear shock here. And I'm going to illustrate to you how I'm not sure how the original owner was going to mount this shock, but it wasn't going to be like this. One end of the shock is way too big and the other is way too small, so we need some sort of equalization going on here. I do have some ideas and they do involve a hacksaw. Those weren't the only parts that were in need of some modification, and I found that out soon enough when I went to go mount the motor onto the swing arm. I'm pretty sure these are 15mm dropouts, so they should fit very snugly on this axle, but they're just a little too tight. Also, the swing arm is slightly too narrow, so I found a method for stretching it just slightly. And now I'm not taking off a ton of material, just enough to get it over the axle. I definitely didn't want to take too much off, so a lot of grinding and test fitting back and forth. And finally, the motor is mounted on the swing arm. I know it looks very tight and very close, but everything moves smoothly. Almost every piece on this frame required some sort of modification or clearancing to have it fit well together. Thankfully, all of those woes are behind me and now I can start assembling the frame. The front end definitely goes together a lot better when you have all of the components, like the bottom bearing. My shock mounting solution actually turned out very well. And my cat is still hanging out while I'm assembling things. Now time to install the front disc brake. I'm not going to be installing a rear brake because I'm going to use the regenerative function of the controller to slow down the bike as well as the front brake. I would not recommend solely relying on the regenerative braking because if you do have an electrical failure of any kind, then you basically have no brakes. And I thought I was done modifying things on this bike to fit, but I will get to that kickstand in a later video. Now that we have most of the frame painted and assembled and it's sitting on 2 wheels all by itself, I think this is a good stopping point for this video because we made a lot of progress and it's coming along very well. There definitely were a lot of little annoyances when it came to fitment and assembly, but that does kind of come with the territory when you're building your own bike. And while they were annoying, none of these problems were too difficult to overcome. I think it's looking really good so far, but we definitely have a long ways to go. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Join me in part 2 where we make even more progress and start stuffing a lot of the electronics inside of this beast. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.